Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about the first two stages of memory, sensory memory and short-term memory. And we'll talk a little bit about long-term memory, but in the next video, we'll talk more about long-term memory as well. So there's three different stages of memory storage. The first is sensory memory, and sensory memory has to do with our visual memory and our auditory or sound memory. And our system actually holds information in our sensory memory for less than a second, so not very long. But we get all sorts of sensory information coming in, and we don't always pay attention to all that information because it's not necessarily important to us. But if it's something that we know is important to us, we have to pay attention to it, and then we have to hold it in our sensory memory long enough to get it to our short-term memory. And our short-term memory lasts just 12 to 15 seconds. So a lot of what we have to do is repeat the information in order to hold it in our short-term memory just long enough till we write it down on a piece of paper. So if you imagine you're in a class and you're looking at a PowerPoint slide, the teacher's teaching you a new term that you've never seen before, you're going to look at that, you're going to see that slide, you're going to see the image of that slide in your mind, and maybe you're trying to remember a particular word. So you might be repeating that word in your mind. You might also be looking at that word on that PowerPoint slide, and then you're going to go down and write it on your notes. And sometimes what happens is you get interrupted right in the middle of it, or it takes long enough to write it down, especially if it's a long word or a complicated word. Halfway through that word, you've forgotten the rest of it. So you have to look back up to get that information again. So sensory memory is really, really brief, but it's really useful as well. And short-term memory is kind of our working memory. It's our memory that we use to get information that we're seeing or hearing, and information that we want to learn down on paper before we can move it on to our long-term memory. So our long-term memory, so we have to do something in order to get information from short-term memory to long-term memory. And most of us, what we do, we'll take notes in class, and that's no longer your memory, that's just your notes, right? So you've gotten it from your sensory memory, held it into your short-term memory long enough to get it on paper, and then what you have to do is when you get home, you've got to repeat that information, right? You have to do something to make that information meaningful and to connect it to your long-term memory. And most of us use flashcards and different things to repeat information to get it into our long-term memory. And that actually works pretty well, but it really kind of produces more weak memories that don't last that long. So that's why when you study really hard for a test, you do well on that test, and a few weeks later you don't remember that information very well. It's because those memories weren't stored very deeply. Now, other memories can be stored more deeply. If you can connect new information that you're learning to information that you've learned before, it makes it a much stronger memory, and you'll be able to remember it for a much longer period of time. In the final lecture in this chapter, I'll talk about different memory techniques that you can do, but making things meaningful to you, if things are meaningful or interesting to you, you're going to have a much easier time remembering it in your long-term memory. And then once you get it into your long-term memory, you also have to get it back out of your long-term memory when you need it. And we talked about having that experience where you studied for something, you know something, might even be like just popular information, a movie star or a rap artist that you really like, and you can't remember their name, and you know their name, you just can't get it back out. That's a retrieval failure, and we're going to talk about that. So this is the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory, and basically what it says is that memory's information actually has to go through all three stages of memory in order to be stored for a long period of time. So information has to go through our sensory memory, our short-term memory, and then our long-term memory in order to be stored for a long time. And I think I mentioned that with the sensory memory, we have to pay attention to it. With the short-term memory, we have to pay attention to it. We have to hold it in our short-term memory. And then in order to get it from paper to our long-term memory, we have to rehearse it and transfer that information to the long-term memory. So our sensory memory captures a near exact copy of sensory information. It's less than a second. So our visual memory, they call it our iconic memories sometimes as well. But these are like photographs that we can sort of see in our mind. Like you could probably look away from this PowerPoint slide and still visualize the images that are on here, the eye and the ear. And you can even sometimes visualize a word that you're trying to remember to write down in your notes. So they are really accurate images of what you're seeing. It's an accurate copy of what you're seeing, but it dissolves in less than a second. We also have auditory or sound memory. They call it echoic memory, and it's exact copies or repetitions of the sounds that we hear. And it's interesting that memories are really stored phonetically by sound sometimes. So when we're trying to, maybe take notes on a word, we might repeat that word aloud to ourselves, and so that's using our sound memory. And then we might also look at it visually as well, and that would be using our visual memory. So we often store things phonetically or by sound. And sometimes when we're trying to remember somebody's name, we can't remember it if it's a movie star or whatever. We might come up with similar sounding names. We know it starts with a J or a W or whatever it is. And sometimes that will help trigger our memory. So memories can be stored visually, and they can also be stored by sound. Then we get to our short-term memory, and our short-term memory is pretty limited. It only lasts for about 12 to 15 seconds as well, and it just holds small amounts of information. It's very sensitive to interruption or interference. So if you're looking at the slide and you're trying to write down the term that the teacher is teaching you, if somebody bugs you or something happens in between, you're looking at the screen and starting to write it down, you can lose that information, and you got to look back up and get the rest of that information again. So it's really sensitive to interruption or interference. But our short-term memory is our working memory, and it's similar to like RAM on a computer. So just when you're using that memory, do you have that information in that memory? Once you've written down that information, or if you're lucky enough, transferred that to your long-term memory, it's no longer in your short-term memory. So the same thing with RAM on your computer. Once you turn your computer off, that memory is gone. It's erased. And the same thing with short-term memory. So the capacity of short-term memory is 7 plus or minus 2, which seems like kind of an odd way to put it, but short-term memory can be different for different people. Most people can remember 7 things in their short-term memory, but there are people that can remember up to 9 things in their short-term memory, and then of course there are people that can only remember 5 and sometimes less items in their short-term memory. And actually there's a digit span test in part of the IQ test that we talked about in chapter 7 that measures how much can you remember in your short-term memory, and it's actually a measure of intelligence. The more you can remember in your short-term memory, the better your IQ is. Now, sometimes people do use different memory techniques that really can help improve your ability to remember more items in your short-term memory, and chunking is one of those techniques. And what people do is and we all kind of naturally do this, is we group information together by category or chunks, and it helps us to remember more things. So if we needed to go to the grocery store to get dinner and we knew we were going to make spaghetti for dinner, we could, we don't even have to remember all the different ingredients that you need for spaghetti. We know we need spaghetti, and we know what ingredients go into spaghetti, so all we have to really remember is spaghetti. But if we had 10 items on our grocery list and we left our grocery list at home, it's pretty likely we're going to forget several of those items as well. One of the reasons why they chunk our phone number and social security number into chunks with those dashes in between them is because that gives us chunks of information rather than this huge long string of numbers to remember. It's actually much easier to remember your social security number because it's broken up into those chunks of information. And if we're given a list of animals to remember, we have that sort of knowledge that they're animals that we're supposed to be remembering. And if we're lucky, we might have seen pictures. I think I posted a video that tests your short-term memory, and it has you're supposed to remember different animals, and can't remember, I think it's a rabbit and a dog and a cow. You can think about there's farm animals, there's pets, there's different kinds of animals, but you could chunk that information and you would know that there are animals in there. And you might know there's farm animals and pets, and that would help you to keep more information in your short-term memory. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Rote rehearsal is what most of us do when we're trying to study for a test and remember things for a test. We just repeat the information over and over again. We test ourselves on that information until we can actually remember it. And the only trouble, it actually does get information into our long-term memory, but it doesn't last for very long. We all know that when we've studied for a test a few weeks later, a lot of that information is gone. So we'll talk in the last lecture of this series about how can we improve our memories, our long-term memories, and what are the other ways we can study and really get that information more solidly into our long-term memory. So that's it about the first two stages of memory. In the next lecture, I'll talk about long-term memory.